He stood in silence, straight-backed, medals gleaming, at his son's graduation, only to be asked to leave because his uniform made people uncomfortable. But Master Sergeant Darius Cole didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't back down. Moments later, 4 Navy SEALs entered the room, and what happened next would ripple across the country. This isn't just a story about a Marine. It's about what happens when dignity refuses to move, when presence becomes protest, and how one man's stillness sparked a movement that would change generations. The folding chairs were set up in perfect rows, stretching across the polished gymnasium floor of Willow Creek High School. Blue and white balloons clustered in the corners. A banner reading, "Congratulations, Class of 2025, hung proudly over the makeshift stage, and the sound of shuffling programs and proud murmurs echoed beneath the steel rafters. Parents were filing in, dressed in their Sunday best, many with camcorders, flowers, or tear-glossed eyes. At the back of the gym stood Master Sergeant Darius Cole, United States Marine Corps, retired. His uniform was pressed so sharply it looked like it had been folded with a ruler. The medals on his chest glinted under the fluorescent lights, and the creases on his pants were crisp as a newly sharpened blade. He stood tall, though a slight stiffness in his right leg, an old injury from his 3rd deployment, gave a subtle limp to his steps. He had arrived early, too early, and stood near the doors, watching as rows slowly filled with proud families and fidgeting siblings. The seat designated for him, Row F, Seat 3, was still unoccupied, but he didn't want to sit. Not yet. He liked to watch the crowd, scan the faces, absorb the energy in the room. Today was the kind of day that didn't come often, and he wanted to take in every second of it. His son Malik was graduating today. The thought filled him with something deeper than pride, a quiet awe, almost reverence. Malik was the kind of young man Darius had once hoped he'd raise, back when he was a fresh recruit, scribbling dreams into a pocket-sized notebook during downtime in the barracks. Smart, kind, relentless in everything he pursued, captain of the debate team, intern at the mayor's office, full scholarship to Howard University in the fall. And he was walking the stage today, his son, the same boy who used to fall asleep on his chest while he read Where the Wild Things Are after long patrol shifts. The boy who had asked why people looked at them funny in certain restaurants, who once tried to use his toy sword to chase off the landlord when they were nearly evicted. The boy who had grown into a young man, Darius could barely believe he had the honor of calling his own. He stood with his hands behind his back, quietly humming a hymn his mother used to sing on Sunday mornings. The Star-Spangled Banner began to play softly from the speakers. Guests continued to file in. Ushers in school polos guided them to their seats, passing out programs and nodding politely. That's when he saw them, 2 security guards moving toward him with stiff postures and forced politeness, barely masking discomfort. Both wore earpieces and bore the kind of corporate security name tags that indicated they were contractors, not school employees. "Sir," the taller one began, glancing at the medals on Darius's chest like they were a problem to be solved, "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside for a moment." Darius turned slowly. "Is there a problem?" he asked evenly, his voice measured but firm. The shorter guard stepped forward. "We've had a few concerns raised about a man in uniform loitering near the entrance. Some parents said they were uncomfortable. We just need to verify you're supposed to be here." Darius blinked. For a moment he couldn't tell if he'd misheard, but the looks on their faces told him he hadn't. "I'm here for my son's graduation," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out the program. His name, Master Sergeant Darius Cole, was printed clearly under the Parent Guests of Honor section. "His name is Malik Cole. I'm on the guest list." The guards barely looked at it. "I'm sure you are," the taller one replied, "but we need you to wait outside while we confirm with administration." Parents nearby were beginning to look over. Darius could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tilt of tension. He had been in combat zones. He knew how to read a crowd, and this crowd was watching something they didn't understand, something they didn't want to. Darius took a breath. "I've waited years for this moment. I'm not missing my son's graduation because someone feels uncomfortable with a Marine standing quietly in the back." "We're going to have to insist," the shorter guard said, placing a hand lightly on Darius's arm. That was the moment, not the touch itself. It was gentle, measured, trained. But what it implied, that he was a threat, that he was to be handled, that his presence, his posture, his very identity in uniform was enough to draw suspicion. All while he stood alone in the back doing nothing but watching. "I've buried friends in this uniform," he said quietly, his voice so soft it made both guards lean in. "I've walked through dust storms and firefights and come home to a country that barely looked at me. I am not leaving." The guards were growing visibly uncomfortable. People were really watching now. Some kids from the student council whispered to one another. An elderly woman clutched her pearls. One man in a suit whispered something to his wife. Darius could feel the eyes, but more than that, he could feel the old weight. The same weight that had followed him home from Iraq. The same weight that whispered in gas stations and airports and job interviews, "Not here, not you, not enough." "Let's just go outside and talk," the taller one said again, this time with a bit more force. Before Darius could respond, the gym doors opened once more, and the room fell silent. 4 men entered, moving with a synchronized grace that required no words. They wore dark civilian suits, but their posture, their gait, their eyes, all screamed military. More specifically, special operations. The lead man was broad, bald, with eyes like steel and a face carved by time and purpose. Behind him, a Latino man with a scar tracing down his jawline, a shorter, wiry man with glasses and sleeves that barely covered his tattoos, and a 4th man, tall, dark-skinned, with a calmness that only came from having seen the worst of war and lived to understand it. They moved like a unit, like a SEAL team, because they were. The lead man spoke first. "Is there a problem here?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It had weight. The guards turned, startled. "This is a private school function," one said quickly. "We're handling a situation with this guest." The bald man stepped forward, pulling out a worn military ID. "Chief Petty Officer Ryan Hale, U.S. Navy SEALs, retired, and those 3 gentlemen with me, same. We served with Master Sergeant Cole in Kandahar, Fallujah, and Marja. You don't ask him to leave. You shake his hand and thank him." Gasps rippled through the gym. "He's here as a guest," Hale continued, his eyes never leaving the guards. "If you have an issue with that, we'll be happy to discuss it outside. All of us." The guards faltered. One muttered something into his radio. The other looked around as though hoping for someone to step in. No one did. Instead, a voice broke the silence. A woman, sitting near the front row, slowly stood. "That's Malik's father," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. "He's done more for this country than most people in this room. Let him see his son." Another voice chimed in, then another. A slow, rising chorus. "Let him stay. He's earned this. He belongs here more than some of us." And then, unexpectedly, the principal stepped onto the stage. Mr. Franklin, silver-haired, stern-faced, but known for being fair. He looked at the guards and then at Darius. "Master Sergeant Cole," he said, his voice amplified by the mic, "it is an honor to have you here today. Please come sit in the front row." Applause erupted. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't polished, but it was real. Darius stood still for a moment longer, then nodded. He walked past the guards without another word, his limp barely noticeable. Hale and the other SEALs flanked him, not protectively, but proudly. The crowd parted like the sea, and for the first time that morning, Darius allowed himself to smile. He sat in the front row. Row A, seat 1. And when Malik crossed the stage an hour later, eyes scanning the crowd, he paused, his grin breaking wide as he spotted his father. He raised his diploma high in the air, not for the crowd, not for the cameras, but for the man in the front row who had given him everything. The applause that followed was for him, for both of them, and in the far back the two guards stood silently, watching as the room they had once tried to control united around something much stronger than discomfort: respect. After the ceremony ended and the last name had been called, families poured onto the gymnasium floor, arms flung around graduates, camera flashes sparking like fireflies across the space. Teachers smiled in exhaustion and pride. Balloons bobbed against the high ceiling, tethered to wrists and folding chairs. But Malik didn't move toward the crowd like the others. He made a beeline straight for his father. Darius rose to meet him, arms slightly extended, unsure whether a hug would embarrass the newly graduated young man. But Malik didn't hesitate. He nearly ran the last few steps and wrapped his arms tightly around Darius, clutching him in the kind of embrace that held years of effort, of longing, of sacrifices made in silence. "You made it," Malik whispered, voice thick. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world, son," Darius said into his ear, holding him with a careful strength. "Not just today. I mean, you made it through everything. You kept showing up, even when Mom left. Even when it felt like the whole world was watching you to see if you'd crack. You never did." Darius pulled back slightly to look into his son's eyes. "You gave me something to stay strong for." Malik wiped at his face quickly, hoping none of his classmates had seen the tears welling. "You saw what happened earlier, right? With those guards?" "I saw. I wanted to do something, to say something," Malik said, his voice dropping low. "But I didn't want to make a scene on my day. I'm sorry." "Never apologize for that," Darius said. "You didn't put me in that situation. They did." The SEALs had lingered nearby, allowing father and son their moment. Now they approached one by one. "You raised a fine man, Darius," Ryan Hale said, extending a hand to Malik. He shook the world today with nothing more than a smile and a walk across the stage. Malik shook his hand, then looked up at the trio standing behind Hale. "You all served with my dad?" "In some of the worst places and through some of the toughest fights," said Reyes, the scarred Latino man, "and your old man never flinched. Not once. He taught us how to patch up wounds with duct tape and make coffee out of sand," joked Whitaker, the wiry one with glasses, grinning. "Most importantly," added Jalen Thompson, the tall, dark-skinned SEAL, "he taught us what it means to carry yourself with quiet dignity. We weren't going to let that be disrespected today." Malik nodded, overwhelmed. "Thank you for that, for standing up for him." Reyes looked at Darius. "We stood up for all of us, kid. There are battles you fight with a rifle and ones you fight just by standing still in a room and not leaving. Today, your dad won the latter." As the crowd began to thin and people filtered out toward their cars and dinners and post-grad parties, Darius and Malik remained for a moment longer. The gym had mostly emptied when the principal, Mr. Franklin, approached. His expression was one of careful reflection, as though still sorting through his thoughts from earlier. "I owe you an apology, Master Sergeant Cole," he began. "I should have intervened sooner." Darius shook his head. "You did what you could." "But it wasn't enough," Franklin replied. "We train our staff to de-escalate, to welcome, to observe without assumption. Clearly, that training didn't take." "It happens more than you think," Darius said. "But it shouldn't," Franklin responded, firmer now. "You stood for this country, and today you stood for something else too, for every kid watching to see what happens when a wrong is committed in public. For every parent who's been questioned for simply existing in a space they belong to." He extended a hand. "Thank you for your service and for your patience." Darius took it. "Let's just make sure my son and others like him never have to watch something like that again. That's all I ask." Franklin nodded solemnly. "You have my word." Outside, the afternoon sun had warmed the sidewalk. Families spilled out with congratulations and laughter. Malik walked beside his father, the diploma tucked into a blue leather folder under his arm, but his gaze wasn't on it. He watched Darius, who walked with quiet grace, still in uniform, despite the pain in his leg, still carrying the weight of something larger than himself. "Can I ask you something?" Malik said. "Always." "When those guys came up to you, what stopped you from just leaving or snapping back?" Darius didn't answer right away. They'd reached the car, and he unlocked it, placing his cap on the passenger seat. Then he turned, his face calm. "Because leaving would have told them they were right, and snapping would have told them they won, but staying?" He nodded slowly. "Staying said I knew who I was, and I didn't need their permission to belong." Malik smiled. "I want to be like that." "You already are." They drove to a local restaurant, a small family-owned spot that Malik had chosen weeks in advance. The owner, an older woman named Miss Clara, had known Malik since he was in diapers. She embraced him at the door, congratulated him 3 times, and insisted dessert was on the house. As they sat down to eat, a few other families from the school came in. Some gave polite nods. One father approached, sheepish. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier," he said. "My son asked me on the drive home why those guards were talking to you like that. I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry. And thank you for how you handled it." Darius thanked him with a quiet nod. Miss Clara brought out a large slice of cake with "Congratulations, Malik," scrawled in icing. She winked and whispered, "And a little thank you for your daddy, too," before returning to the kitchen. They ate. They laughed. And in the midst of it all, Darius allowed himself a moment he rarely indulged in. He relaxed. The next day, photos of the incident had gone viral. Someone had captured the exact moment the SEALs had entered the gym. Another had filmed part of Colonel Hale's speech. The footage made its way to social media, then to morning news shows. The headline appeared in bold letters. "Marine asked to leave son's graduation. What happened next silenced the room." Darius's phone exploded with messages, some from old squadmates, others from strangers, a few from former commanding officers who'd seen the story and reached out just to say, "Thank you for standing your ground." Malik saw the attention, but Darius refused interviews. "Let the message spread," he said, "but I didn't do it for airtime." The school issued a public apology. The guards were quietly dismissed. And more importantly, the administration invited Darius to speak at the next assembly. "I'm not a speaker," he said. "But you are a father," Franklin replied. "And there are kids here who need to hear from someone like you." Darius stood before a packed auditorium a week later, not in uniform this time, but in a simple suit. Malik sat in the front row. Students, parents, and teachers listened as he told the story, not just of that day, but of the years leading up to it. "Respect isn't granted by titles," he said. "It's proven by how you treat those with none." Afterward, a freshman girl approached him shy. "My dad's a veteran," she whispered. "Sometimes I think people forget that. Thank you for reminding them." Darius knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "Your dad's service matters, and so do you." That summer, the town council voted to name a section of the community park after local service members. They asked Darius to help cut the ribbon. He tried to refuse at first, but Malik stood beside him, urging him forward. "You didn't just stand for me that day, Dad. You stood for all of us." So he stood again, quietly, steadily, the way only a Marine knows how, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was standing alone. Summer had settled over Willow Creek with the kind of heavy warmth that made the air smell of cut grass and distant barbecues. The town moved at a slower pace this time of year. Kids rode bikes in lazy loops around cul-de-sacs. Sprinklers ticked rhythmically against dry lawns, and in the evenings, screen doors creaked open to let in the cicada hum and late sunlight. For Darius Cole, it was the first summer in nearly 2 decades where he wasn't overseas, on a base, or recovering from deployment. For the first time in what felt like forever, he woke up without the immediate press of duty on his chest. And yet, it was far from idle. He spent his mornings volunteering at the local community center, teaching self-discipline classes to young boys whose mothers had signed them up with hope in their eyes and exhaustion in their voices. He taught them how to box, sure, but more importantly, how to breathe through frustration, how to sit in silence and listen to their own thoughts without fear, how to treat others not as threats, but as neighbors. He didn't lecture, he didn't posture, he just showed up every day, on time. Word of what had happened at Malik's graduation had reached farther than the town lines. It had echoed across veteran forums, school boards, and even civil rights newsletters. One article described Darius as the Marine who stood without speaking and moved the room with his silence. He didn't read the articles himself, but people sent them, sometimes folded up in envelopes with handwritten notes, sometimes printed and highlighted with comments like, "My son showed me this," or "Your courage reminded me of my father." He always read the letters, and he kept every one. Malik, too, was adjusting to a new rhythm. With college approaching, his days were filled with prep courses, orientation meetings, and quiet anxiety about leaving home. But more than that, he found himself asked to speak at youth leadership events, at school board panels, even once through a Zoom call to a classroom in New Jersey who had studied the video as part of a social awareness project. "I didn't even do anything," he told his father one evening on their porch. "You did. You stood there and took it. I just sat in the crowd, hoping it would stop." "You watched," Darius said, sipping his coffee. "You paid attention. You carried the moment with you. That matters." "But I didn't speak up." Sometimes the best way to speak is to remember, to pass the story on so it doesn't get buried. Malik leaned back in his chair. "You always do that. Make it sound easy when it isn't." Darius smiled faintly. "That's what parents do. Make hard things feel survivable." Malik turned toward him, his expression more serious. "Were you scared?" The question lingered. Darius didn't answer right away. He watched a moth spiral lazily around the porch light. Then, softly, "Always. Any time I walked into a room where I didn't know how I'd be treated, any time I wore the uniform and felt more judged than thanked. But you learn to carry fear the way you carry a pack. Tight, balanced, close to the body. You don't let it make your decisions. You just let it remind you you're still human." Malik nodded. "That's what I want to remember when I leave." "You'll forget," Darius said, then added, "but you'll remember again when you need to. That's how it works." One evening in late July, the mayor's office called. They wanted to formally honor Darius and the SEALs who had intervened. They were planning a small ceremony, nothing extravagant, just a recognition of what had happened. Darius hesitated. "I'm not looking for plaques or parades," he told the woman on the phone. She replied, "We're not giving you a plaque. We're dedicating a community mentorship scholarship in your name for young men of color who want to serve, lead, or build something lasting." That made him pause. "Okay," he said, "but only if you don't put my name bigger than the kids' names on the applications." She laughed. "Deal." The ceremony was held at the town library, modest, respectful. The SEALs came, all 4 of them, dressed not in uniform, but in the kind of suits worn by men who spent more time in desert fatigues than in boardrooms. Hale spoke briefly. "We don't give medals for restraint," he said. "We don't issue commendations for silent endurance. But we should. Because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stand in a place where he knows he's not wanted and refuse to vanish." Darius didn't speak much that night. He thanked the crowd, posed for a few pictures, accepted the folder containing the scholarship paperwork, but mostly he stood near the edge of the gathering, watching from the sidelines, just like he had at the gym that day, making sure the moment belonged to something larger than him. Later that summer, a young man approached him at the gas station. "You don't know me," he said, "but I was at the graduation. My mom told me to pay attention when people like you are around. I just wanted to say thank you for not leaving, because I saw myself in you." Darius offered a firm nod. "Then don't forget what that looked like." "I won't," the kid said, almost whispering. "I promise." The seasons changed. Fall crept in with cooler mornings and sharper shadows. Malik packed for college, folding shirts, rolling socks, slipping framed pictures into boxes. Before he left, he found Darius at the kitchen table, polishing his shoes out of habit more than need. "I'm going to write you, you know," Malik said. "You better." "Not emails, real letters, paper, like you used to send me from base." Darius looked up, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Old school. I like it." They hugged at the bus station, a long, quiet embrace. When the bus pulled away, Darius stood on the curb long after it disappeared down the road. That night, he sat alone in the living room, a cup of coffee untouched, beside him. On the wall above the mantel hung a photo, a still from the graduation, framed and given to him by Malik. It showed Darius, mid-salute, Seals at his side, the entire room rising behind them. Beneath the photo, Malik had scrawled a note. "Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. Thanks for teaching me that." Darius stared at it for a long time. Then he rose, turned off the lights, and walked to bed, knowing for once that the battles of the past had finally given way to a quieter kind of victory. Winter arrived earlier than usual that year, dusting Willow Creek in snow by the second week of November. Sidewalks shimmered under thin layers of frost, street lamps cast soft golden halos in the evening fog, and breath turned visible in the air like ghosts of the past. It was the kind of winter that made everything quieter, more still, forcing the town to move a bit slower, speak a bit softer. Darius Cole didn't mind the cold. After years of desert heat and barracks fans that barely stirred the stale air, winter felt like a cleansing, a reset. He adjusted his scarf, tugged his coat tighter around him, and stepped into the community center where he'd volunteered all summer. Inside, the walls were lined with posters about mentorship, scholarship deadlines, and photos from the recent dedication ceremony. A new sign had been added since the fall, the Cole Initiative, Leadership Through Service. At the bottom of the plaque was a quote, "Stand, even when no one stands with you." The program had grown faster than anyone expected. By winter break, 15 local teens were enrolled, many of them recommended by school counselors, local churches, or sometimes just a watchful neighbor who noticed a boy falling behind. Darius ran weekly sessions, some in the gym, some in the old computer lab upstairs. Sometimes they just sat in a circle and talked about school, about anger, about pride and fear, and what it meant to carry something heavy without dropping it. One boy, Terrence, barely spoke for the first 2 weeks, kept his hood up, eyes low, answers short. Then, during a quiet moment after class, he waited until the others had left, then lingered near the door. "They were going to kick you out, right?" he asked. "At graduation," Darius nodded. "They tried." "But you didn't go." "No," Darius said. "I didn't." Terrence looked at the floor, then back up. "My brother, he got kicked out of his school once for not following orders during a lockdown. But he wasn't doing anything wrong. He just went to check on a kid with a hearing aid who couldn't hear the announcement. Did anyone speak up for him?" "Not really. They said he should have stayed put." Darius paused. "That's the thing about rules, Terrence. They work until someone follows them into harm." The boy nodded slowly. You think if my brother had someone like you there, they would have listened?" Darius didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Maybe. Or maybe he'll be the one who shows up for someone else now. That's how it starts." Terrence came back the next week, and the one after that. By Christmas, he was leading warm-up drills in the gym. Malik returned home for the holidays, his presence filling the house with a renewed energy, Darius hadn't realized he'd missed. They talked long into the nights about college life, campus dynamics, professors who expected him to speak for every black student in the room, and how he navigated it with the kind of quiet confidence he'd learned from his father. On Christmas Eve, they sat by the window, hot cocoa in hand, watching snow gather on the railing. "You know," Malik said, "I think that day, my graduation, it changed more than just our lives." Darius glanced over. "How do you mean?" "I've had people at school recognize my name, not just because of me, because of you. That video's been used in classes, in seminars. One guy said it was shown during his law enforcement training." Darius raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" Malik nodded. "It's not always positive. Some people roll their eyes, say the story's been exaggerated, but others, they stop and think. That's what matters, right?" Darius leaned back in his chair. "It's a strange thing. You spend most of your life trying to blend in, to not be a target. Then one day, just by standing still, you become a mirror, and everyone sees something different in the reflection." Malik was quiet for a moment, then, "That's why you stayed, isn't it? Not just for me, for the ones watching." Darius looked into his son's eyes, so full of clarity, of wisdom, that had grown like wildflowers through cracked pavement. "Yes," he said. Malik smiled, then pulled something from his pocket, a small box. He handed it to his father. "Merry Christmas," he said. Darius opened it slowly. Inside was a keychain, a replica of a military challenge coin. On one side, the Marine Corps emblem. On the other, engraved words, "I stood. He saw. We remember." Darius swallowed hard. "You had this made?" "I designed it. Thought maybe one day some other father might hold it in his pocket and remember that silence isn't weakness, that standing still doesn't mean surrender." Darius turned the coin in his hand, its weight more than just metal. It carried stories, moments. An entire room's held breath. "I'll carry it always," he said. The night grew darker, the snow thickened. But inside, father and son sat in the kind of peace earned through fire. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of understanding. Winter passed. Spring returned. At the year's end, Willow Creek held a new tradition, inviting community heroes to speak at graduation. Darius declined the podium, but he sat in the front row as another young man, one of his mentees, spoke on his behalf. "He taught me that showing up is half the fight, that dignity doesn't come from how others see you, but from how you see yourself." In the back of the crowd, 4 men in dark suits stood silently, watching. Ryan Hale, Reyes, Whitaker, Jalen. They didn't announce themselves, didn't demand recognition. They simply stood, hands clasped, proud. After the ceremony, they found Darius near the exit. "You're still standing," Hale said. "Always," Darius replied. "We got something for you," Whitaker added. He handed over a box. Inside was a folded American flag. Not just any flag. This one had flown over Camp Fallujah. With it, a letter signed by every man from their old unit still alive. "We figured it belonged to someone who never stopped serving," Hale said. Darius felt the lump rise in his throat, hot and sudden. "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Reyes said. "You've already said enough." They parted ways in the parking lot. No long speeches, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a shared understanding, a nod, a clasped hand. Later that evening, Darius hung the flag above the mantel, just below the photo Malik had framed. The coin sat in a small wooden box on the shelf, alongside the keychain and his original dog tags. Each piece told a story, not of war, not of medals, but of the moment a father refused to disappear, of the silence that shook a room, and the boy who watched and remembered. Summer arrived again, almost exactly 1 year after the graduation that had rippled through Willow Creek like a shockwave. The gym where it all happened had been renovated, new bleachers, fresh paint, even a display case near the front office with the inscription, a moment that moved a nation. Inside it were photos, letters, and a copy of the graduation program with a name circled in black ink, Master Sergeant Darius Cole, USMC, returner. He'd tried to convince the school not to include it. "This wasn't about me," he had told Principal Franklin, who only smiled and said, "But you're the reason we saw what we needed to." Life had settled into a rhythm again. Malik had finished his first year at Howard with honors, returning home with stories of new mentors, old injustices, and dreams of law school that grew more vivid with each passing month. He took a job with the local legal aid office for the summer, helping draft documents for people who couldn't afford a lawyer. Every evening he shared the day's stories with his father. Some were hopeful. Others made them both sit in silence for long minutes afterward. "They don't even know how to ask for help," Malik said once. "It's like the world convinced them they didn't deserve it." Darius just nodded. "That's how it works. Shame makes a man smaller before he even opens his mouth. But if you'd left that gym, if you'd let them make you feel smaller, I'd be telling every kid in that room it was okay to shrink themselves too," Darius finished. "That's why I stayed." One warm July morning, Darius was standing in front of the Cole Initiative bulletin board, pinning up a new scholarship flyer, when a soft voice behind him said, "Excuse me, are you him?" He turned and saw a woman in her mid-40s, hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes glassy and cautious. "I'm sorry?" Darius said. She held up a folded newspaper, an old edition from last year, yellowed now with time. On the front page was the photo of him being saluted by 4 Navy SEALs, Malik in the background holding his diploma. "My son goes to Willow Creek," she said. "He's been struggling. Behavior issues. The school counselor recommended this program. I wasn't sure about it, but then I saw this." She tapped the photo. "Saw you, and I remembered that story." He waited. "I just wanted to say thank you for staying, for standing there. You didn't know anyone was watching, but I was. And now my son's here too, because of you." She gestured to a boy standing awkwardly near the door, oversized hoodie covering half his face. Darius gave him a nod. "Welcome," he said simply. That boy stayed, and 3 more after him, and 5 more after that. The Cole Initiative needed a second room. Later that month, Willow Creek hosted its first Day of Honor, a community-wide celebration of veterans, public servants, and educators. They asked Darius to give the keynote. He almost declined, but Malik sat him down and said, "You keep saying you're not a speaker, but people listen when you say nothing. Imagine what might happen if you spoke." So he stood on the small amphitheater stage in the park, wearing his suit again, not his uniform. The war was long behind him, but the lessons remained stitched into the lines of his face, the set of his jaw, the weight of his stillness. "I'm not here today because I did something special," he began. "I'm here because I refused to stop being myself in a place that told me I didn't belong, and because others, good men, brothers, stood beside me when I couldn't be loud." He paused, scanning the crowd, faces of every color, ages, uniforms, civilians, children sitting cross-legged on blankets. This isn't a story about a Marine or a graduation. It's a story about choice. Every day, we're given the choice to do what's easy or do what's right. That morning, it would have been easier to walk out, but I didn't. Because I had a son watching. Because I had ghosts behind me. Because I remembered what it felt like to be pushed aside and told to wait for a better time. He took a breath. Sometimes the loudest message you'll ever send is by staying put, standing your ground, not shouting, just being. Because when the world expects you to disappear, presence becomes resistance, and resistance becomes hope. The crowd rose to its feet, not in a frenzy, not in spectacle, but in unity, in understanding. And there, in the third row, Malik stood tall, clapping slowly, his eyes never leaving his father's. That night, back at home, Darius sat in the kitchen, a cup of tea cooling beside him. the framed photo still watching from the mantel. Malik entered quietly and placed something on the table. It was a folder. Inside were early drafts of his law school application essays. "Can I show you something?" he asked. Darius nodded. Malik opened the first page. It read, "The day my father was asked to leave my graduation changed everything. Because he stayed, I learned the power of presence. Because he stayed, I found my voice. Because he stayed, I know now. I want to spend my life standing for others the way he stood for me." Darius said nothing. He didn't have to. Malik leaned back. "You think I'll get in?" "You're already there," Darius said, touching the folder. "You've already begun." The world moved on, as it always did. New stories pushed old ones aside. But in Willow Creek, the echoes remained. In the school gym, a display case. In the community center, a second bulletin board. In every boy who walked into the Cole Initiative, unsure, unseen, and left standing straighter than when he arrived. And in a young man with a voice strong enough now to speak for himself. All because one morning a Marine stood his ground, and 4 SEALs stood beside him, and the silence that followed became the loudest thing the town had ever heard. In early August, a letter arrived at Darius Cole's modest home on Sycamore Street. It came in a plain envelope bearing the seal of the Department of Defense, but it wasn't one of those cold, official communiques that made your stomach sink. The handwriting on the address line was deliberate, careful, done with the kind of reverence that comes from someone who grew up being taught to respect those who served. Darius opened it on the back porch, where the cicadas hummed their steady afternoon song and the wind moved lazily through the trees. Inside was a letter from a young man named Eli Carpenter, a student at West Point, class of 2027. His words were precise but not stiff, honest but not overwrought. And they hit Darius like a quiet tide, rising and folding over his chest with every sentence. "Sir, I watched the video of what happened at your son's graduation at least a dozen times. At first, because it made me angry. Then because it made me think. And finally, because it made me realize how much more I have to learn, not just as a cadet, but as a man. We're trained to lead, to read terrain, to anticipate threats. But no one talks much about moral terrain, about what it feels like to stand still while everything in the room moves around you, waiting to see if you'll flinch. You didn't. You gave the rest of us a new kind of field manual. Thank you for not leaving. Respectfully, E. Carpenter." Darius folded the letter slowly, carefully, and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't know the young man, probably never would, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the echo had reached someone. That fall, the Cole Initiative expanded. A second location opened on the other side of town, near the industrial district where school attendance dipped and job applications were often met with silence. They didn't have much, just a few volunteers, borrowed office space, some second-hand mats, and a few aging computers, but the walls were covered with photos. Not of Darius, of the boys who came. Terrence, now a peer mentor. Deshaun, who had started his own podcast about navigating high school as a young black teen. Luis, who had been close to expulsion 2 years ago, but now stood at the top of his welding class, on track for certification before graduation. The kids saw their own faces on the wall, their own names on the door, their own possibility in the faces of the men and women who showed up every week to remind them that showing up was sometimes the bravest thing you could do. Darius was invited to Washington, D.C. in October. A panel on veteran transition programs wanted him to speak about building local trust and grassroots mentorship. He'd never flown commercial in his life. Malik booked the ticket. "You'll be fine," he said. "Just don't bring your old boots. They'll hold you up at TSA." The flight was uneventful. The city felt different, grander, like it had swallowed too many stories over too many years. But Darius walked the marble halls in his best suit and sat at the long table with others, some in uniforms, others in blazers, some with degrees stacked behind their names. When his turn came, he stood without notes, hands folded at his belt, voice steady. "I don't run a nonprofit," he began. "I don't have funding, not really. I've never written a grant in my life. But I know what it's like to stand in a room where people want you gone. And I know what it feels like when someone stands beside you instead." He looked at the audience, policymakers, generals, advocates. "That's what we do. We stand beside the boys who don't know yet how to stand on their own." Later, after the panel, a woman from the Department of Education approached him. "We'd like to feature your story in our national mentorship curriculum," she said. "We want students in every state to hear about what happened in that gym." Darius hesitated. "Only if it focuses on the lesson, not the moment." "What's the lesson?" "That courage doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just refuses to move." By winter, Malik had been accepted to every law school he applied to. Howard, Columbia, Georgetown. He chose Howard. "They raised me," he told his father. "Now I want to give something back." He started working part-time with the Cole Initiative's legal aid outreach, teaching kids how to write appeals, how to advocate for themselves, how to read the fine print on rental agreements or job contracts. One Saturday morning, he ran a workshop called Know Your Rights. Darius watched from the back, arms crossed, heart full. The same boy who used to tuck toy soldiers into his socks before church was now teaching other boys how to protect their futures. A local documentary crew came to film the initiative's anniversary. The producer had seen the viral video the year before and followed the story ever since. She interviewed Malik and some of the mentees, asking what it meant to them. "Mr. Cole doesn't teach with lectures," Terrence said. "He teaches by just being there, even when we mess up." "He's the first man I met who didn't expect anything back," said another. "Didn't tell me to act right to earn help, just helped." The producer asked Darius for an interview. He declined, but he allowed her to film the weekly group circle. No names, just hands passing a talking stick, voices speaking about fear, goals, mistakes. The footage aired statewide. Donations tripled in a week. That spring, Willow Creek voted to rename the gymnasium where it all started. It became the Darius Cole Civic Center. The plaque read, "In honor of the man who stood without flinching, taught others to rise, and reminded a town that silence can be the start of everything." The ceremony was small, humble, as he preferred. But when the curtain dropped to reveal the sign, Darius felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Peace. Malik stood beside him, hand on his shoulder. "You did this, Dad?" "No," Darius said. "We did. All of us who stayed when it would have been easier to walk away." The townspeople applauded. And somewhere in the crowd, 4 men stood shoulder to shoulder. Hale, Reyes, Whitaker, Jalen. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't carry flags, but they carried the moment, still, like a banner between them. Later that night, Darius returned home. He sat at the kitchen table where everything had started, where he once wrote letters to a son sleeping in the next room, wondering if he was doing enough. On the wall above him were the photo, the challenge coin, the folded flag. He took out the letter from West Point, opened it again. "You gave the rest of us a new kind of field manual," he smiled. "Sometimes you teach not by leading a charge. Sometimes you teach by staying put, by refusing to yield, by standing in a storm with nothing but your name and your purpose. And sometimes the world changes because of it, even if it takes a while, even if no one claps at first, even if they ask you to leave before they understand why you stayed." He folded the letter back into its envelope, stood, and turned out the light. Tomorrow, more boys would come. Tomorrow he'd stand again. And this time, they would already know they belonged. A full year passed since the morning that forever altered the course of not only a graduation ceremony, but a town's conscience. Yet, in many ways, the story hadn't ended. It had only widened, echoing across time and space, reaching people who had never set foot in Willow Creek, but who recognized its truth as if it belonged to them too. It was the second annual Day of Honor when a group of high school seniors from another state arrived by charter bus, escorted by their principal and a local nonprofit director. They'd driven for over 8 hours just to visit the Cole Initiative's center, which had now grown to occupy the entire lower wing of the old Roosevelt Municipal Building. The walls were covered with testimonials, photos, news articles, and artwork by the kids who'd found their footing within these halls. Malik met them at the door, now a full-fledged law student finishing his second year at Howard. He wore no tie, no briefcase, just a simple collared shirt and jeans. What made him stand out wasn't his dress. It was the way the younger students leaned in when he spoke, the way they saw possibility in his every sentence. He introduced them to Darius after the tour. The students stood in quiet awe, not because he demanded it, but because something about his posture, still straight as ever, commanded it. One of the visiting students, a lanky girl with glasses and braids tucked into a beanie, stepped forward. "My dad showed me the video the night before I had a school board meeting," she said. "We were trying to get security protocols changed after my classmate was treated like a threat for having a hoodie and earbuds in." Darius nodded, listening. "I was scared to speak, but then my dad said, 'Remember the Marine who stood still and changed a room,' so I spoke." "Did they listen?" Darius asked. She smiled. "They did, and they made changes." He put a hand on her shoulder. "Then you're part of the story now." Everywhere he went now, Darius saw signs of change, not big ones that screamed for attention, but quiet revolutions. The old corner store near Jefferson Street now offered free after-school snacks to any student in uniform, regardless of what kind. The church down the road had started a stand-up initiative, helping adults complete GEDs and prep for citizenship tests. Even the guards who worked school events now went through an additional cultural sensitivity training that included watching the Willow Creek graduation footage and discussing it. It wasn't about shame, it was about sight. People had started seeing what they used to overlook. On his birthday, Darius received a visitor at home. It was a courier, not from the post office, but from the Pentagon. Inside the small sealed box was a handwritten note and a unique medal designed specifically for civilians who had demonstrated exceptional public courage outside of combat. Only a handful had ever been awarded. The letter read, in part, "Master Sergeant Cole, this recognition is not for a single act, but for the quiet revolution you began the day you stood your ground in the Willow Creek High School gymnasium. You reminded this nation, its institutions, its people, and its youth that valor is not only born in battlefields, but also in community halls, classrooms, and silence. Your courage helped shape the next generation of military leaders who now study your example in our academies. Thank you for teaching us how to stand when it's hardest." Darius held the medal in his palm. Its weight was less than he expected, but its meaning pressed deep into his chest. Later that week, at the initiative's leadership circle, he brought the medal, set it on the table. "Let every student hold it. This belongs to all of you," he told them, "because none of this matters unless the lesson carries forward." Each boy and girl passed the medal with reverence, not because it was shiny, but because they knew it meant someone like them had been seen, respected, honored. The town eventually changed their annual calendar. June 14th, Flag Day, was now also Day of Presence, inspired by what the mayor's office officially called the stand that changed Willow Creek. They asked Darius if he'd give a speech at the unveiling of a mural painted downtown. It featured 4 silhouettes, a Marine, 4 SEALs behind him, and a boy in a cap and gown standing at the center. Malik, now a co-founder of the expanded Cole Initiative, painted part of it himself. Darius stood before the crowd, many of them faces he'd known since long before any of this began, and cleared his throat. "This story never belonged to me," he began. "It started long before that day in the gym. It started in every room where someone stood up for their dignity and was told to sit down. Every sidewalk where someone was watched more closely than they were welcomed. Every hallway where a kid carried more silence than support." He looked at the mural. "And it continues with each of you who refuses to be erased." The crowd stood again, not out of habit now, but from muscle memory, an act that had come to mean more than politeness. It was solidarity, recognition. A moment passed hand to hand. When the mural was complete, the town held a candlelight walk through the city, stopping at places where mentorship had taken root. The diner that offered free breakfasts for students. The courthouse, where a judge now offered first offense youth programs instead of sentencing. The park bench where Malik once studied for the bar exam, under a lamp his father had fixed with his own hands. Years passed. The initiative grew beyond Willow Creek. New chapters opened in Detroit, Atlanta, Albuquerque, San Diego. Every location told the story, not just of a man in uniform, but of the moment he didn't leave, and the ripple it caused in a world starved for examples of integrity. On the 5th anniversary of the graduation, Willow Creek High School welcomed Malik Cole as its commencement speaker. He stood behind the same podium where the principal had once offered his father a front-row seat. He wore a dark blue suit, polished shoes, and a small lapel pin in the shape of a coin. His voice, though measured and calm, carried the weight of 5 years and 5 decades. "My father didn't become a hero the day he stood in that gym," he told the class. "He became one the day he showed up to every game, even when I didn't score. The day he showed up to every teacher conference, even when the questions were loaded. The day he showed up when the world told him not to." He paused. Most people think bravery is a flash of lightning, a burst of action, but sometimes it's just refusing to step back, refusing to lower your eyes, refusing to let someone else tell your story. The gym was silent, reverent, charged. Then he smiled. "And if you're lucky, one day someone will stand for you. And if you're wise, you'll spend the rest of your life standing for someone else." The applause that followed wasn't loud because it had to be. It was loud because it couldn't be anything else. Darius stood in the crowd, hands clasped behind his back, watching his son step away from the podium. The same walk, the same steady eyes. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself one thought. He had done enough. He had stood enough, and now others would keep standing too. Because of a moment that began not with thunder or fireworks, but with one man refusing to leave, and 4 SEALs who walked through a door, not to make noise, but to ensure the silence was never misunderstood again. The evening of the 5th anniversary ended not with speeches or celebrations, but with something simpler. The town had arranged for an open house at the Cole Initiative's headquarters. Alumni from every chapter across the country had been invited to come, share food, swap stories, and sit in the space where the idea of being seen, truly seen, had first found roots. The front room had been transformed into a gallery. Photos lined the walls. Not portraits, but moments. A boy hugging his mentor outside the courthouse, a girl in scrubs holding up her CNA certification, a young man shaking hands with a senator during a youth advocacy day in Washington. Interspersed among them were handwritten quotes on black paper in white ink. "They told me I mattered before I believed it myself. He didn't save me. He just stayed. We don't all get rescue stories. Some of us just need a place to stand." Darius arrived late on purpose. He knew the weight his presence still carried, and tonight he didn't want the focus. He wanted to see what it had become without him needing to anchor it. As he entered, a hush fell briefly, but it was warm, not reverence, but respect, the kind that comes from shared history, not hierarchy. He moved from room to room slowly, paused to greet young adults he'd once taught how to tie a tie or write a resume. They came in waves, hugging him, shaking his hand, smiling through tears. Some introduced their spouses. One woman carried a baby and told Darius she named him Cole. He didn't speak much, just listened, let them fill the air with what they needed to say. Eventually, he reached the final exhibit, a glass case in the center of the main hallway, surrounded by quiet. Inside it was the medal he'd received from the Pentagon, the challenge coin from the SEALs, a copy of the original letter from West Point, and a folded program from the graduation that had started it all. Beneath the case was a single plaque. He stood, we saw, we remember. Behind him, Mullick approached. "Looks good," his son said. "You did all this?" Mullick shrugged. "We all did. The mural team, the alumni board, everyone wanted to honor it without making it too much about you." "Good," Darius said with a nod. "It was never just about me." He stepped back and watched as a group of new mentees walked past the exhibit. A few paused. One boy squinted at the program behind the glass. "Hey," he whispered to his friend, "that's the guy from the video." "No way," his friend replied. Darius turned slightly, his presence catching the corner of the boy's eye. Recognition bloomed slow and wide across the kid's face. "You're him," he said, stunned. "I'm one of many," Darius replied. "But you're the one who didn't leave," the boy said. "You just stood." Darius smiled gently. "Sometimes standing is enough." The boy nodded like he'd just heard something he'd be thinking about for years. As the evening wound down, Darius and Malik sat on the back steps of the building, just the two of them, beneath a sky littered with stars and the low hum of street lamps. Music from a speaker inside drifted through the walls, soft, joyful, familiar. Malik passed over 2 mugs of coffee. 5 years, he said. Darius took his and sipped. "Feels like yesterday." "Sometimes I wonder," Malik said after a pause, "if things would have turned out different if you'd walked away that day." "They would have," Darius replied without hesitation. "For me, for you, maybe even for this town. But the thing is, people think standing your ground is about defiance. It's not. It's about refusing to let someone else define your worth." Malik looked up at the stars. Funny how something so quiet can be remembered so loud. They sat in silence for a while, not needing to speak. The kind of silence that didn't hurt, that didn't accuse or question, the kind that said, "We're still here." When they stood to go, Malik stopped and looked his father in the eye. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying, for being the kind of man I want to become, for letting me watch." Darius reached out and pulled him into a brief, firm hug, then said, "You're already him. You've already stood." That night, as Darius drove home, the streets were empty except for the flickering lights of the mural downtown. It had been retouched recently, fresh paint, brighter contrast, a new coat of sealant to preserve it through the coming winter. He pulled over and stepped out, letting the quiet hold him. The mural depicted 4 SEALs stepping into a gymnasium, a Marine standing still, a child at a podium looking forward. But something new had been added. In the background now stood a crowd, not faceless, not blurry, real people, students, parents, community members, all of them rising to their feet. And in the corner, tucked almost out of sight, a small silhouette of a boy with a hoodie watching from the doorway. The artist had written 3 words beneath the whole thing: "Because he stayed." Darius stood for a long while, then quietly, he turned and walked back to his truck. Not because his work was done, but because, finally, the world was still standing with him. 3 months after the mural unveiling, a letter arrived addressed not to Darius, but to the Cole Initiative. Attention, whoever stood that day. It was written in a careful, looping cursive that spoke of age and deliberate thought. The return address was a nursing home in Alabama. The letter was from a man named Luther Green, 87 years old, a Korean War veteran and retired teacher. He wrote, "I watched your story on my granddaughter's phone. She's the one who told me it had gone viral. I don't know much about all that, but I know this. When I came home from Korea, I walked into a school to apply for a job, still in uniform. The secretary asked if I was there to clean the floors. I left without saying a word. That was 1954. I didn't speak of that moment again until now. But when I saw you in that gym, standing in full dress blues while being asked to leave, I saw myself. And I watched the world stand for you in a way it never did for me. I cried. I cried because you stayed, because you didn't shout or shrink, because you were the answer I never got, even though I stopped asking long ago. Thank you." From an old soldier who needed to see, before he went, that sometimes the world does learn. The letter was framed and hung in the initiative's office with no fanfare, no headlines, just a quiet reverence. Beside it, Darius pinned a small sticky note with a single sentence. He finally got his answer. That winter, Willow Creek experienced the kind of snowfall that shut everything down. Schools closed, roads buried, even the town square wrapped in a blanket of untouched white. Power lines sagged under the weight. For 3 days, silence ruled the streets. On the second day, the Cole Initiative building opened its doors anyway. Volunteers came on foot through knee-high drifts, pulling sleds of bottled water, flashlights, and blankets. A few brought hot soup. A local business donated a backup generator. The initiative transformed into a warming center. No questions asked, no forms to fill. Darius stood by the door, as always, greeting, helping, staying. A young woman walked in with her son. He was maybe 7, shivering, wearing a jacket 3 sizes too big. The woman looked around the building, taking it in, the walls of photos, the laughter from the kitchen, the warmth radiating not just from the space, but from the people in it. "You him?" she asked, nodding toward a faded photo on the wall, the one from the gymnasium. Darius gave a small nod. "I remember that story," she said. "Didn't think it was real. Just something people share to make themselves feel better." He didn't answer, just handed her a cup of cocoa for her son and a blanket for her shoulders. "I guess it is real," she said after a pause, "the standing part." Darius looked at the boy curled into a warm chair near the radiator, holding the cocoa like it was treasure. "It's real," he said, "because people made it real after." That night Malik showed up with more supplies from town hall. He stood at the door for a long moment before entering. "Dad," he said, brushing snow from his coat, "you need to see this." They walked outside into the swirling wind. Across the street, etched into the untouched snow on the blank wall of a hardware store, someone had written in large looping letters, using nothing but the imprint of their boots, "Stand like Cole." Below it, smaller, were footprints, children probably, who had walked around the letters, adding hearts and handprints. Darius stared at it, the wind pulling at his coat. "You ever think," Malik said, "that staying that day might have been the loudest thing you ever did?" Darius smiled faintly. "I didn't do it to be loud. I did it so you'd never have to wonder if silence was the only choice." They turned and walked back inside, the snow beginning to erase the message one flake at a time. But the people who saw it, who walked past it, who knew what it meant, they wouldn't forget. Because messages don't have to last in the snow to last in the heart. By spring, the phrase had taken root. Stand like Cole. It showed up in high school yearbooks, on the back of local basketball jerseys, in graffiti-turned murals in cities far from Willow Creek. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't about marketing. It was a reminder. To stay, to refuse, to root your name in place when the world wants you to vanish. Years later, long after the viral video had faded from the trending lists, long after cameras stopped calling, a teacher stood in front of her 8th grade civics class. She held up an image from an old news clipping, the graduation photo, now laminated and yellowing slightly at the corners. "This," she said, "is what it means to change a room without shouting, to protest without signs, to stand not for show, but for truth." A student in the back raised their hand. "What happened to him?" She smiled. "He went home, kept helping, kept standing, until standing became something we all remembered how to do." And on her desk, facing her students each day, was a small wooden sign. "Stand like Cole, because some stories don't end. They become posture, and posture becomes legacy." In the twilight years of his life, Darius Cole never sought a stage. He had turned down invitations to televised interviews, had quietly refused requests to turn his story into a documentary, and had declined offers to run for public office. He wasn't interested in being a symbol, a campaign, or a brand. He was interested in being present, in showing up for the things that mattered. He could be found most mornings seated on the bench outside the Cole Initiative headquarters, an unassuming seat with a brass plate that read simply, "This is where he waited, and we found our way." He no longer ran the day-to-day operations. Malik and the growing team of directors handled that now. The initiative had grown to over a dozen cities, with partner programs in military towns, inner cities, and underserved rural schools. The curriculum had been officially adopted by 5 states, but Darius remained the soul of it all. When a new chapter opened, they sent him a video call. When a young mentor lost faith, they asked Darius to speak with them. His words had become a balm, his presence a lighthouse. One such morning he sat on the bench as a young man nervously approached, clean-shaven, freshly cut hair, wearing a simple collared shirt with a notebook tucked under his arm. "Sir?" he asked. Darius looked up. "My name's Jamal. I'm about to start the new program down in Tallahassee. I wanted to ask, how do you do it?" "Do what?" "Stand," Jamal said, "when everything around you wants you to sit." Darius smiled slowly, took a deep breath of the spring air. "You remember who you're standing for," he said. "That's how." Jamal nodded like it settled something inside him. As he turned to leave, Darius added, "And if you ever forget, find a kid and listen. Really listen. They'll remind you." That afternoon, Darius made his way to the gymnasium, the one that now bore his name. He didn't come for a ceremony. He came to sit at the edge of the bleachers and watch a youth basketball game between 2 neighborhood teams. He clapped softly when someone made a good pass, chuckled when a player celebrated too early and missed a layup. Halfway through the game, a small girl wandered over, no more than 6 or 7, holding a piece of paper and a pink crayon. "You're Mr. Cole," she said with certainty. "I am." "My brother says you stood so the world would remember kids like us." "That's so," he replied. She nodded and held out the paper. It was a child's drawing, crude lines and colors, but clearly depicting a man in a uniform standing in front of a crowd, with hearts drawn above his head and the words, "Be strong like Mr. Cole." He took it in his hands carefully, as if it were fragile. "Thank you," he said. She grinned and skipped away. He folded the paper and placed it gently inside his coat pocket. 1 week later, Malik was organizing an archive event, gathering all the letters, drawings, newspaper clippings, and emails sent over the years into a permanent exhibit. He found that pink drawing folded neatly in a pocket of Darius's favorite coat. Next to it, tucked into the lining, was a note in his father's handwriting. Just 6 words. "If they forget, remind them gently." When Darius Cole passed away at the age of 83, the entire town paused. The mayor ordered flags to half-mast. Schools closed for the afternoon, not because he was famous, but because he was theirs. The funeral was held in the same gymnasium. the same one where he'd once been asked to leave. This time no one asked questions, no one stood in his way. Rows upon rows filled with students, mentors, Marines, SEALs, teachers, and strangers who had only ever known him through the echoes of his courage. Malik gave the eulogy. My father didn't change the world with speeches. He changed it with stillness. He didn't chase recognition. He created refuge. He didn't shout. He stayed. He looked up at the crowd, and when the world asked him to move, he reminded it, gently, firmly, that presence is power, that standing still is sometimes louder than marching, that dignity isn't something granted, it's something we carry, and he carried all of us with him. After the final hymn, 4 men rose from the front row: Ryan Hale, Reyes, Whitaker, Jalen, older now, grayer. Some moved a little slower, but they still stood tall. They approached the flag-draped casket and laid down a single medal each, earned in combat, worn on their chests, now offered in silence. Then, with practiced precision, the 4 Navy SEALs stood at attention and saluted. Outside, in the soft sun of early spring, children stood in clusters around the mural on Main Street. The town had added something new to it. A 5th silhouette now stood behind the boy in the cap and gown, a tall figure in civilian clothes, hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Below the mural, fresh paint carried one final phrase: he stood, and now we all do. And across the country, in classrooms, courtrooms, youth centers, and gyms, that story was told again and again, not always in words, not always in pictures, but in the way a student refused to back down when treated unfairly, in the way a mentor stayed after hours for a kid who had no ride home, in the way a teacher looked a child in the eye and said, "You matter, just as you are." They stood. They remembered. They kept the silence loud, because one man had refused to leave, and it changed everything. Years after the last salute had been rendered and the folded flag placed into Malik Cole's hands, the legacy of Darius Cole lived on, not as history, but as habit. The world had moved on in the way that time insists on doing, but what had been born inside that gymnasium and cultivated for decades after had become a root system stretching beneath communities far from Willow Creek. It had become a language spoken in deeds rather than words. The Cole Initiative, now with over 20 regional centers and international affiliates, had become more than a program. It was a movement. Universities taught its curriculum under social justice and civic leadership courses. Law schools cited Malik Cole's lectures on restorative practices in juvenile justice. Community centers in Johannesburg, in Mumbai, and Chicago's South Side bore plaques reading, "Inspired by the Stand." Every new cohort that entered the mentorship program received a small token, a brushed steel coin with 4 simple words etched into one side: "Be still, be seen." On the other side, the phrase that had become both a compass and creed: "Stand like Cole." But no one held those words more dearly than Malik. Years had aged him. He now had streaks of gray at his temples, and a voice made richer by time and experience. He'd become a respected legal advocate for systemic reform, often returning to schools, centers, and courts to speak not as a figurehead, but as a son still echoing the man who made him. He kept his father's bench, polished it every Sunday, sat on it when he needed to think. On the 20th anniversary of that infamous graduation, Willow Creek planned a public tribute, not a memorial. That wasn't the spirit of it. It was a reaffirmation, a recommitment, a town-wide stand day. Every school would hold assemblies. Every student would watch a dramatization of what had happened that day, read letters from the original mentees, and write their own reflections about what standing meant to them. Malik was asked to deliver the keynote at the central gathering held in the very same gymnasium. He stood at the podium with the same posture his father once held, hands clasped, eyes calm, voice clear. "This story doesn't end when someone dies," he said. "It ends only when no one remembers. And I don't mean the headlines. I don't mean the photo. I mean the choice he made, my father. The choice not to raise his voice or lower his head. The choice to let his stillness be the loudest sound in the room." He looked around the crowd. Thousands. Watching, listening. He stood in that gym so I wouldn't have to explain to my own son what it felt like to be asked to leave dignity behind. And now we stand, all of us. Because standing still, when you have every reason to walk away, is how we change the world. He left the stage to the sound of chairs scraping back, not to leave, but to rise. Everyone stood, the mayor, the principal's great-granddaughter, the bus driver who remembered that day and still carried the image of the SEALs saluting, veterans, teachers, children. No music played, no national anthem, just silence. The kind of silence that hums with conviction. Later that week, Malik visited the archive, the space that now housed Darius Cole's belongings, curated with quiet reverence. His uniform, the medal, the pink crayon drawing from the little girl at the game, the letters from veterans and kids and strangers. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. Atop it sat a new book. Its title was simple, He Stood. It wasn't published for profit. It had no barcode, no commercial intent. It was a compilation of first-hand stories, witnesses, mentees, children grown up into mentors, strangers who saw the footage and changed careers, lives, minds. Each page was a single voice in a growing chorus. And at the back of the book was one last letter, one Malik hadn't known existed. It had been left with the archive's director by one of the SEALs, Jalen. On the day of the original tribute years ago, written in ink on aged paper. To whoever reads this, when we walked into that gym, we didn't know we were walking into history. We just knew one of our own was standing alone. And we don't leave our own. Darius wasn't just a Marine. He was a monument, not carved from stone but from principle. I've seen men face death with less courage than he had in that moment of stillness. And the real thing? He never once looked at us when we entered. He didn't expect rescue, didn't even expect to be understood. He stood for someone else, for his son, for that room, for every kid who had been told they didn't belong. We just made sure the world noticed. Stand like him, and if you can't, then make damn sure no one standing alone stays that way. JT. Malik closed the book slowly, sat beside it for a while. As he left the room, he paused at the exit. There, in etched brass above the doorway, were 6 words. If they forget, remind them gently. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click. And outside, the world continued, children learning, mentors waiting, a bench still warm from someone who'd paused there, and footsteps. Not in unison, not in formation, but steady, everywhere, because one man had refused to leave. And so many others had remembered what it looked like when someone stayed, and now they did the same.